Hidden in the Library of Congress is a filing cabinet filled not with sound recordings, but with transcribed voices. Thousands of pages of interviews taken between 1936 and 1940. Government writers, sent into homes across 24 states, had one mission: capture people's memories before they vanished. That effort, the Federal Writers Project, was a New Deal program that employed unemployed journalists, novelists, and researchers to document ordinary lives. It produced 2,900 life histories, which then sat in the library largely unread for decades. I discovered those files while chasing a different question: why so many American courthouses and civic buildings from the late 1800s have proportions that feel wrong for the people who use them? The deeper I dug into architectural records, the more obvious it became that buildings weren't the whole story. The witnesses were. Those 2,900 interviews record direct memories from people born before a dramatic United States transformation. Memories that don't always match the standard history. To be precise about the timeline, someone born in 1855 who lived to 85 would have died around 1940. That person would have been a child in the 1860s to 70s, and thus a first-hand observer of a staggering rapid transition, not one that unfolded over centuries, but within a single lifetime. Their grandchildren, born in the 1920s and 1930s, heard those stories directly. That generation is the last major link to oral memory of the old world, and they are nearly gone. There are striking examples. Mary Kelly, born in 1851 in Southfield, Michigan, reportedly lived to 113 and died in 1964. A life that spanned from before the Civil War to the television era. Maggie Barnes, born to a formerly enslaved woman in the early 1880s, is said to have lived to about 115, dying in 1998. Research groups have validated multiple super-centenarians born in the 1850s. Many more made it to 90 or 100. That entire cohort carried memories bridging two almost unrecognizable Americas. The government could have preserved all of these recollections. Instead, after recording 2,900 life histories, the project was defunded in 1939 during a transfer to state control and effectively shut down. Those interviews were boxed up and largely inaccessible until the 1970s, leaving 3 decades when the last direct testimonies of pre-transition Americans were largely ignored. So what is this before everyone kept talking about? The date that keeps coming back is October 8, 1871. Americans learn about the Great Chicago Fire, but almost never about the simultaneous devastation that night elsewhere. In Peshtigo, Wisconsin, a firestorm wiped out the town in roughly an hour. Estimates place the death toll between 2,000 and 2,500, making it the deadliest wildfire in U.S. recorded history. The blaze consumed about 1.2 million acres. Survivors described winds so fierce it lifted people off the ground, flames moving faster than a person could run, and such intense heat that people crossing open ground reportedly caught fire without being touched by visible flames. Reverend Peter Pernin, who survived by plunging into the Peshtigo River, published an account in 1874 describing behavior that doesn't fit ordinary wildfire science. Air so rapidly depleted of oxygen that some victims showed no burns yet were dead, and a fire that behaved like a detonation radiating outward, almost as if it had created its own violent weather. That same evening saw major fires or threats in Holland and Manistee, Michigan, and near Port Huron. And across the upper Midwest, fires ignited simultaneously across a vast area. The National Weather Service records these outbreaks as occurring the same night across 3 states. Official explanations invoke drought, accumulated lumber debris, and a cold front with strong winds. But researchers have long been troubled by the simultaneity. Why, in 1883, a hypothesis circulated that fragments of Biela's comet had entered the atmosphere and ignited the blazes from above. A theory revisited in later documentaries and by aerospace investigators. Observers in Chicago reported blue flames in basements, which suggests atypical chemical combustion rather than ordinary wood fires. The comet fragment idea was never proven, but neither was it definitively dismissed. Crucially for this inquiry, many elderly people interviewed by the WPA writers in the 1930s would have been children in 1871, old enough to remember or to have been told vivid stories about that night the sky turned red. In the Library of Congress's brief description of the 2,900 interviews, Tales of Surviving the Chicago Fire and Pioneer Journeys, barely hints at what those testimonies may contain about that night and other anomalies. Loss of other documentary evidence deepens the mystery. The 1890 U.S. Census was the most detailed up to that time. Full household schedules, immigration and naturalization details, language proficiency, home ownership, Civil War service. 62.9 million Americans were recorded. Uniquely, that census broke with long-standing practice and had no local courthouse backups. The master set sat only in the Commerce Department's basement in Washington, D.C. on January 10, 1921. A fire in that basement destroyed about 25% of the records outright and severely damaged another 50%. The cause was never conclusively established. Possible explanations range from a discarded cigarette to faulty wiring to spontaneously combusting sawdust. What followed is even more troubling. Surviving records, perhaps half the census, were moved to storage and left untouched for 12 years with no restoration attempt. In December 1932, the Census Bureau chief clerk sent the Librarian of Congress a list of documents marked for destruction. The 1890 census was on it. The librarian found nothing worth preserving. Congress approved destruction on February 21, 1933. The very next day, February 22, President Hoover laid the cornerstone for the National Archives building, a fireproof facility explicitly designed to prevent such losses. The detailed record of the transition era was therefore effectively erased. Of 62.9 million names, only about 6,160 entries survive. What had been the single best documentation of every person alive during that turning point was removed by a sequence of plausible administrative steps: fire, neglect, paperwork, sanctioned destruction, that together look harder to accept as coincidence. There were other social ruptures. From 1854 to 1929, roughly 250,000 children were sent from New York, Boston, and Philadelphia on orphan trains to rural families across the Midwest and West, an effort largely organized by the Children's Aid Society and similar institutions. At stops, children were shown and chosen in scenes likened to auctions. Many ended up as farm laborers. Fewer than half were true orphans. Many were children of immigrants or impoverished parents who could not keep them. What is rarely emphasized is that older children were often pressured or required to sever ties with their origins. Names were changed, pasts were unrecorded or falsified, and organizational records were inconsistent. As a result, entire lives were disconnected from their histories. People who could not tell their grandchildren where they came from because they genuinely did not know. Look at the timing. Orphan Trains operated from 1854 to 1929. The 1871 fires happened in the middle of that era. Large photographic curiosities and reports of giant skeletons cluster between 1850 and 1900. Certain maps and place names quietly disappear in the mid-1800s. Architectural styles shift from grand classical scale to simpler modern forms in that same window. By the 1890 census, the one record that could have documented everyone across that transition was eliminated. Patterns stack up rather than scatter. Then there's 1893, the world's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. Over 6 months, the White City hosted 27 million visitors across more than 200 buildings on 630 acres. Official accounts say massive neoclassical facades, huge domes, and precise sculptural detail were erected in under 2 years, using temporary materials and hand tools. No cranes, no modern machinery. And then nearly all the structures were demolished after the fair, the one exception being the Palace of Fine Arts, now the Museum of Science and Industry, preserved because it was built fireproof to protect artwork. Similar spectacles happened in Paris, 1889, Buffalo, 1901, St. Louis, 1904, and San Francisco, 1915. Massive, elaborate edifices erected quickly, displayed briefly, then torn down or burned. Elderly Americans interviewed in the 1930s remembered walking those white city streets and seeing structures that felt ancient compared with the America being built around them. Buildings that, to them, seem more permanent and integrated into everyday life than textbook histories allow. I keep returning to a single image. In every American county in the early 1950s, there was likely a woman born in the late 1850s who lived into her 90s, surrounded by grandchildren hearing her stories about buildings that seemed ancient even when she was young, about the night the sky turned red over several states, about trains of nameless children moving west, about a world governed by different scales and technologies. When she told those stories, her grandchildren often listened politely and moved on. Her memories didn't match the official narrative, and in 1950s America the textbooks carried the authority. The WPA captured some of those voices, 2,900 documents from 24 states. But what about the other states and the countless elderly people never interviewed? What about family stories shared on porches and at deathbeds in the 1940s and 1950s that no government writer wrote down? Those oral traditions passed to grandchildren who are now elderly themselves, the last living links to first-hand accounts of what preceded the transition. The timeline is stark. Mid-1850s through the 1870s. A landscape of oversized doorways and monumental architecture. October 1871, catastrophic fires across multiple states. The 1890 census, an unparalleled snapshot of 62.9 million people, were later destroyed. The 1890s images and map revisions. The 1893 White City spectacle and its demolition. Orphan Trains severing identities, the 1921 basement fire that damaged the census, the 1933 destruction order, the 1936 WPA interviews, the program's defunding in 1939, and by the 1950s, the passing of the last eyewitness generation, while their grandchildren chose silence because the alternate story was too vast to accept. Those 2,900 transcriptions at the Library of Congress are public and searchable since the 1970s. My question, And the investigation, I urge, is simple. Has anyone read every page with an eye for details that contradict the official record? Has anyone systematically pulled descriptions of buildings, fires, proportions, and technologies that don't fit standard histories? The last people who remembered are gone, and their grandchildren are nearly gone, but the words remain in the archive. Archives do not forget. The records preserve fragments of what encyclopedias may have erased. Somewhere in those Depression-era pages is the testimony of Americans born before the shift, waiting for someone to read what they actually said rather than what the textbooks say they should have remembered.